let's go.
Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Marie Norman. I am really grateful to be asked here today and excited to see some familiar faces. I am a faculty member in the Institute for Clinical Research Education, where I'm a co-instructor on the 2 qualitative research courses they teach there. I'm an anthropologist by training. I did my fieldwork in Nepal, and I think that's really all you need to know about me. So shall I pull up my slides and get to it? All right, so let's see here. Everybody see that?
Yeah,
okay.
Great.
So I wanted to talk about qualitative research for pediatric clinician educators, which is essentially just qualitative research. There's not a huge sort of distinction between qualitative research for clinical research, say, versus educational research. But I wanted to make sure in this that that you steer the conversation. This is a very, very big topic. I know some of you have a background in qualitative research or have done some. Some of you have done various pieces. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about you as well, and then kind of tailor what I'm saying to what you need. So I'm going to launch 2 polls here. In the first one, tell me about your qualitative research experience. Which of the following have you done? And you can select more than one, hopefully. Is that launching? Okay.
Yeah, it's allowing us to click.
Okay. Okay, so there's a fair amount of experience here. So a number of you have worked on a qualitative project. A few of you have led a qualitative project, published a qualitative paper. This looks like a sort of a qualitatively oriented crowd. Awesome. And then I had planned to sort of organize this around 4 questions, and these are the 4 questions. So I was curious where you wanted the focus to be. So the kinds of research questions that are best explored qualitatively, the basic components of a qualitative study, how to evaluate the rigor, and qualitative help at Pitt. And it looks like the focus is primarily the basic components, which is great because that's where the bulk of this is. So can you all see the results? Zoom's made a change here, so it doesn't say share results right away. So here you go. Worked on a qualitative project. There you have it, folks. That's what it looks like. So I'm going to stop sharing that and get rid of it. And then, all right, we've done that. Sorry, I wasn't sure we'd be able to get a poll up there. So let's start in on kind of what sorts of questions lend themselves to qualitative inquiry. And I wanted to start by showing you this little comic. And so take a second to read it. And it's meant to be funny, but it's also got a real kernel of truth to it. So I'm going to ask you what that kernel is. So when you've read it in the chats, just write sort of what you think this is saying. Showing the value of qualitative data, a bias towards quantitative data, absolutely, but not always the best way to answer your research question. There are limits to quantitative data, can't always explain the why of something. Beautiful. Numbers don't encompass everything we want to know. Fantastic. Okay, exactly what I was hoping you'd take away from that. There are so many important questions in healthcare and health research that can't be answered quantitatively. We need the quantitative stuff, but that doesn't answer all the questions we're interested in, including questions about experience and meaning, sort of how do people experience their life and what meaning do they draw from those experiences? which could be something like, what value do researchers find in human-centered design training? Or it could be, what is the experience of having a chronic illness like? Also questions about unexplored phenomena, things where we don't know enough to create a good survey, for example. We don't know the right questions to ask. We don't know sort of what the parameters of the issue are. So maybe, how do national political battles about gender-affirming care affect trans youth? And questions that are about complex, nuanced phenomena. So I'm going to move some things here. Too many things on a small laptop. What issues influence adherence in pediatric burn scar therapy, for example? So things that might involve a lot of different phenomena converging. So that's where qualitative research really shines, is asking those kinds of questions. Probably a lot of the questions that are on your mind as clinicians, kind of like, what's going on with this patient population? Why aren't they doing what is recommended? What else is happening in their lives that impacts their treatment? So qualitative research methods are one tool in, I think, a good health researcher's toolbox. It combines well with quantitative methods, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But here are some of the major distinctions. So quantitative research comes out of the hard sciences, qualitative out of the social sciences. I'm an anthropologist, there's sociologists, social workers, people like that. That's where a lot of this research comes from, which also means it also explains why there's inconsistency in the use of terms, for example, because different disciplines have their own way of employing sort of qualitative terminology. So quantitative seeks to quantify phenomena, while qualitative seeks to explicate meaning. Quantitative privileges breadth over depth, because that's what you need for statistical analyses and statistical validity, while qualitative privileges depth over breadth and does not try for statistical, kind of validity. Quant deals with how much and how many, and qual with what are people doing? Why are they doing it? How are they doing it? How do they explain how they're doing it? In the quantitative column, the data is in numbers, whereas in qualitative, it's words. And words are squishy, and they're interpretive, and they're full of the stuff of human interaction, which makes them hard to pin down, but also very rich with meaning. Quantitative research is deductive. It's top down. You begin with a hypothesis, and then you see whether it holds true. Qualitative is inductive. It allows meaning to percolate up from the bottom, from the data itself. And as a result, it's not focused so much on hypothesis testing, because it's not interested in yay or nay kinds of answers. It's interested in hypothesis generating, kind of what are we seeing here, which can then lead to the development of hypotheses. So those are the kinds of things that qualitative research is good for, and why it brings so much kind of depth and nuance and meaning to questions about healthcare and medicine. Then there's study design in qualitative methods. And by the way, I should say right here, right now, bring up questions anytime they occur to you. You can do it in the chat, and maybe, Noelle, you can help me monitor that, or just unmute and speak. We're a small enough group to do that. So in quantitative methods, there are, first of all, a very complex, and there are many different methodologies, many different ways of designing a study. But there's also a hierarchy, and at the top of the hierarchy is randomized controlled trials. In qualitative research, the gold standard is just appropriateness. Did you choose the right data collection methods, the right data analysis methods, the right theoretical orientation, given your research question? Those things have to dovetail in a way that makes sense. So what that might look like here is this. So for example, let's say you want to identify factors that influence medication compliance among adolescents with epilepsy. You want to know, you notice they're not taking their meds. Why aren't they taking their meds, given that the stakes are really high? And you want to really dig into that question. So one question for you as you design your study is, what data collection methods make the most sense? Should you use interviews? Should you use focus groups? If you use interviews, you're getting a deep dive into an individual experience. If you're using focus groups, you're talking to a group of people who can bounce ideas off one another, but you're not getting as much depth in individual experiences. You could also use observations where you watch what people actually do, but that could be difficult if you're talking about what adolescents do right after they brush their teeth in the morning. So you have to think about what's going to make the most sense given what you want to know. And then you have to think about who you should be talking to. Should you be talking to the adolescents there? Should you be talking to their parents? You know, one of the things about epilepsy is it affects memory and cognition. And so do you want to just talk to the adolescents or to their parents as well? You know, what makes the most sense? And then also think about what theoretical orientation should guide your approach. We're not going to get into this in depth, but do you want to use phenomenology, which really dives into individual lived experiences? Do you want to use grounded theory, which is focused on developing a theory of the case? Do you want to use ethnography, which relies a lot on observation? Probably not in this case. Or do you want to use something like qualitative description, which is specifically designed for healthcare and produces recommendations for care and policy? I feel like I'm going very fast through this. I'm going to take a breather. Any questions just right off the bat, or anything you'd like to say to me? Like, we know this stuff, but we need to know more about X. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if this is an okay pace and an okay level. Okay, I got the thumbs up from Lenisa and from Erica. Anybody else? Also got it. Okay, good. All right, good to know. Let me know if that changes, okay? So another thing about the design of qualitative studies, it's not terribly complex, right? You're just choosing, you know, from between basically three data collection methods, 2 data analysis methods. It's not that difficult. But what you might want to think about is whether you want to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches to take advantage of both, and that's mixed method designs. And these can look various ways. So it could involve, well, there are 2 things to think about. What's the sequence? Which one comes first? And which comes second? And also the focus, which is indicated here by the all caps. You know, which is the bigger study, the more important study, the focus of your work. And that's not bigness defined by samples. Or sample size, because qualitative research uses small sample sizes, but could still be the primary focus of a research project. So you might have, for example, a small qualitative study that is followed by a quantitative study. Can anybody identify in chat sort of where you might see that kind of thing? So when would you want to start with a small exploratory qualitative study and then move towards a larger quantitative study? Any thoughts? If you want to implement,
I think
curriculum.
I've seen a fellow do this with trying to understand the experiences of pediatric oncology physicians in prescribing birth control methods. So did like a qualitative interviews and focus groups here in Pittsburgh, and that informed a larger national survey that she then put out.
Yes. That's a classic example, right on the money. So a qualitative exploratory study to figure out what are the dimensions of this, how do people talk about this, what sorts of questions resonate with the group that you're talking about, and then use those insights to inform a larger survey that can target more people. So that's a good example. Did I see something else in the chat? To identify stakeholders and interests, and then to move into scope. So who's involved in this, you know, problem that you want to explore, and how do they think about it? Nice, before a survey. You could also start with a small quantitative study and follow it with a more central qualitative study. Can anybody think of where you might see something like that? Go ahead and unmute and speak too. No need to type.
I just participated in a study like this where we looked at parenting and medical training, and did sort of a initial study looking at stress levels of parents just through a survey, and then did a sort of follow-up study looking at doing qualitative interviews of parents, sort of targeting the areas that were addressed in the quantitative study.
Nice. Exactly. So in a preliminary interview or quantitative study can point you to the people you want to talk to at greater length in a qualitative study. So that can be a nice pairing. There's also situations where you have a large quantitative study, a big old survey, and it reveals some kind of pattern or insight that you want to then delve more into with a qualitative study. Or a large qualitative study, a central qualitative study, where then you want to kind of explore some factor about it with a quantitative study that sort of zeroes in on, okay, so when did these folks start treatment? Could be demographic, it could ask more survey-oriented questions. So these methods, in short, can combine really nicely to answer questions from multiple perspectives, and also provide what we call data triangulation, where you have data of different types gathered through different sorts of methods and see whether they dovetail, whether they tell the same story. That can be a good way to ensure rigor. Which is not to say, by the way, that a purely qualitative study isn't an awesome thing, a thing of beauty. All right, let's talk a little bit about sampling. This is a sticky point in qualitative research, right? Because for quantitatively trained people, it feels very kind of indefinite, and the numbers seem frighteningly small. But there are some things to know about how qualitative researchers approach this. So first of all, they use what's called purposive sampling, which is a non-probabilistic form of sampling. It's not meant to randomize people or factor in chance. Instead, it really zeroes in on people who are affected by the experience or problem that you want to explore. And the point is to find the right people to talk to who can give you answers, who can explain their experiences and talk about what's involved in a way that sheds light on the topic. There are a number of purposive sampling strategies. Here are some dominant ones. I should move snowball from the top, because snowball sampling is not generally considered very rigorous. But a snowball sample is one where you find participants through other participants. So I start approaching people from within some community and then ask them, who else should I talk to who shares this experience? That can be a good sampling strategy if it's a difficult to access community, where, let's say you're doing research with drug dealers who don't exactly belong to a central data set, or, then you might want to use your connections with people to find other people who can comment on the topic. A stratified sample is one where you try to include meaningful internal variation. So you're not necessarily focusing on all the differences within your sample, but you want to have a sample that looks like the population that you are studying. So you might incorporate people from different medical specialties, different genders, different races, different age groups, just in order to get a kind of a fuller picture of the issue you're exploring. Homogeneous sampling is used a lot with focus groups, where you try to find a sample that's internally similar in some key way. So you might have focus groups that are made up of only parents, and focus groups that are made up only of, patients, so that you can hear those points of view separately. There's criterion sampling, which looks kind of similar to a homogeneous sample, but has more to do with an experiential similarity. So let's say you want to try to improve the experience of people in a waiting room. And so you sample people who've had a bad experience, who have had to wait more than an hour or more than 2 hours. So you really want to dig in on the people who experience something that you are trying to address. And then maximum variation samples are chosen to illuminate a really wide range of perspectives. So you might interview people who loved an educational program and people who hated it, to try to really get at sort of what were the end points in that range of experience. And that can be useful for early exploration. So these are 5 forms of sampling. There are dozens, but these are pretty common. You'll notice that there is not a hugely clear distinction between them. Like there is some overlap and some messiness between them. But I would say stratified sampling is the most common type used. And for that, you really just need to think about kind of what are the internal differences within this group that would make a difference in how they answer questions. Any thoughts about sampling? Questions? And if you work with a mentor, which is what I recommend on a qualitative study, they can help you figure out what makes the most sense and what to call it. A word about sample size is qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, is super comfortable with small sample sizes because it is interested in depth over breadth. And is more interested in talking at length to a smaller number of people than going sort of broad or superficially over a larger number of people. The other thing about sample size is that large samples are not inherently desirable. You might think that interviewing 50 people is better than interviewing 25 or 30, but it might not be, and it might be a big old waste of resources. It all depends on what your question is and what you're trying to find out. But the key, well, got that in the wrong order. The key notion is saturation. So saturation is a concept in qualitative research that refers to the point at which in data collection, you're not learning anything new. You're starting to just see the same themes and the same patterns over and over again. And that is the measure that qualitative researchers usually use to decide whether they have sufficient data. So if you are interviewing, LGBTQ school high schoolers, and you start off interviewing 4 or 5 and you're hearing different experiences and lots of different themes are coming up, but on the 20th you're not any longer and you feel like, oh, I think I know the parameters of this issue. You do a few more interviews to make sure that's the case, and then you can stop. But I know that's not much help when you're writing a grant where you have to, or an IRB proposal, when you are telling them how many people you plan to interview. And so for that, it's helpful to, this is a good rule of thumb. It's not 100% accurate because, again, it does depend on, who you want to include in your sample, what you want to say about different groups within your sample, and what your research question is. But 20 to 30 people is usually a safe number for a qualitative study. And if you want to say something meaningful about subgroups within that group, then you would need 20 or 30 people per subgroup. And in a grant proposal or something, you could say we plan to interview 25 people or until saturation is reached. Because you can often reach saturation at much lower numbers than that. Does that make sense? I'm going to pause again here because sampling is a tricky thing in qualitative research. Again, a mentor can help you think this through. Go ahead.
Sorry, I believe I probably asked you in class, so I'll ask for a refresher. I remember when I was first introduced to the concept of saturation, I was taking a grant class, and one of the comments I had for one of my colleagues was, but how do you know that 26th person wouldn't have said something unique?
Different.
And I guess I could really use a refresher. Not that I'm anxiously thinking that if I stop at 25, the 26th person is going to say something so elegant and so nuanced and so whatever. But yeah, I guess if you wouldn't
Yeah.
mind giving a refresher on that.
Sure. So you will always learn something new from new interviews, right? The question is whether you are learning something new that really informs an answer to your research question. So, you know, any individual has stories to tell and experiences to share that are unique. But the question with saturation is, do you know enough to answer your research question? And if those sorts of patterns are the same over and over again, it is possible that if you did 10 more interviews, you would get to more insight into that pattern. But it's, you know, where do you stop? You know, 100, 300. And so it's a good sort of proxy for saying, and it's been tested. There's research behind saturation, you know, that tests whether where people think they've reached saturation is in fact, you know, where the dominant themes and issues have been raised. So, so yeah, and it's just from the perspective of establishing rigor in a publication, it is generally accepted, particularly if you include a citation. It's an idea, not to get too far into the weeds, but it's an idea that comes out of grounded theory. And grounded theory has a very particular approach to research, which is very flexible and kind of changes course as it goes. So people who are using grounded theory might start off with one sample in mind, and then based on the things they find from those interviews, decide, hey, I need to talk to this group of people. And then sort of change, you know, kind of move in a different direction sampling wise. And because they do that, they need to have some measure of kind of when is enough with each of those groups. And that's why saturation came to be. Yeah. Jen, did you have a hand up, or there's a little red X up?
Please ignore that. I have no idea how to take it down. So I apologize. We can all laugh at me not knowing how to use my reactions in Zoom.
Zoom never tires of throwing new things at us.
Full support, not a no at all.
Exactly.
Could you maybe give an, I mean, how does one define that then ahead of time, the saturation? Is that what the reference is? I was thinking when you just said that last about having a rigorous publication and how.
Right, because that's intention, right? With what you have to produce in our world ahead of time to get funding and IRB approval. So, you know, you're not going to know when you reach saturation until you do the research. But there are citations which I could send that establish when saturation is generally met, like how many interviews. It's like 12. And so I think that from the perspective of rigor, if you plan to interview 20 to 30 people, but then cut it short because you'd reach saturation, that's something that people in the qualitative world understand and respect.
And then saturation's just defined by you feeling you, in regards to your primary question, aren't getting.
You're not hearing anything new that sheds light on that question. And you always, from that point, always do a few more interviews to kind of test that. But you know, I think Lenice's question is a good one. Like, how do you know it wouldn't be on the 8th additional interview where you found something really important? But there is research you can hang your hat on that shows that saturation is generally reached within 6 to 12 interviews. But you know, 6 doesn't feel like enough, and it might not allow you to explore a stratified sample, for example. So, you know, pushing that limit a little bit is a good idea. But, you know, let's say you plan to interview 25 people and the 24th person keeps dropping out, you know, of your interview. That's not necessarily a crisis. You don't have to reach 25 if you feel like you have reached saturation before that.
Thanks.
Yeah. And again, this is all because qualitative research is designed to provide insight into a problem, not to test it statistically. You know, so it is not trying to reach a magical number where you can say something is significant statistically. So that having been said, you often operate in a world where the people reviewing grant applications are quantitative in their orientation and don't understand this distinction. So you also have to be prepared to push back, because there will be people who say, well, why don't you use 50 people? And if you don't think there's any merit and a lot of time and money wasted on 50 people, you also need to be able to push back and provide citations that say that is not the goal of qualitative research. It's not about generalizability. It's not about statistical probability, because not everybody who makes decisions in medicine knows what they need to know about qualitative research to judge it.
I'd really also say too that in addition to kind of the citations, but also, being prepared for the pushback, but also the humility and the humbleness in it, and saying, here's my conditional plan. If I need more information to reach saturation, here's my conditional plan. If I reach saturation before that, because funding agencies are looking for good thinkers who can kind of troubleshoot their way out of problems, and also are resourceful, with money that is being entrusted to you.
Such a great comment, right? So if the NIH doesn't have to pay for those 20 additional and maybe extraneous interviews, where would you put that energy instead? So that's a really good comment. Nice. So let's move into data collection. And again, this is in qualitative research, there are really 3 data collection methods. Not absolutely. Some people use concept maps, some people use social media analysis, but the dominant ones are interviews, focus groups, and observations. So interviews are one-on-one conversations with people, structured conversations around a research question. Focus groups are a group conversation about that question, and observations are watching people in a naturalistic setting to find out what they do as opposed to what they say they do. So let's talk a little bit about when you would use each one. So when would you opt? And again, this comes back to the sort of appropriateness measure for study design. When might you use interviews? When should you tack towards interviews? As opposed to, let's say, focus groups.
So I can get started. So for me, as a clinical psychologist who works a lot with interpersonal violence, sexual assault, exposure, I would do interviews if it's a very if it's a very sensitive topic that I want the person to be comfortable to be able to share. It doesn't mean you can't do that in a focus group.
Right.
But I think that if you really want people to open up about their lived experience with something that isn't like commonly talked about, for me, an interview would be the way to go.
Yes. So if you have any reason to think that the presence of other people would create reticence or pain or harm, you do not want to use a focus group, and that's when you would want to use an interview. So you also want to use interviews when you really want to know about people's individual stories and experiences, which a focus group does not allow space for. As Lenisa said, when the topic's highly sensitive or personal, and where people get a lot of benefit from participating in interviews because it allows them to kind of compose and share their narrative of an experience. And if you feel like that would be true, if a woman who's experienced postpartum depression, would really benefit, say, from telling her story and talking about how it felt, and at length, an interview makes sense. When then would you use a focus group? You figured it out, Jen. It's gone. So given that there are all those benefits to interviews, focus groups. Here, I'll jump ahead. Use focus groups when you think that interplay among the participants adds value, like where people, when you ask one person one-on-one what their thoughts are on a subject, they are just thinking the way they're thinking. They don't have the benefit of hearing what other people think and adjusting and saying, oh my gosh, you are so right. I didn't even think about that, but yes. And so when that interplay is valuable, focus groups can be really terrific. And sometimes it is about somewhat sensitive topics, but one where there's therapeutic and kind of cathartic value for people to share their own experiences, you know. When the topic lends itself to discussion or dialogue, and when hearing one another's perspectives might really be valuable. And then observation should be used when you want to see how people behave. If you ask people, how do you talk to your patients about this? They'll tell you one thing. But how do they talk to their patients about that when they're stressed and crazed in the course of an average day? And that's when observing clinical interactions and other kinds of interactions can be super useful. Got this groovy little Zoom light, but it covers things, and then I have to move them around. And you also want to be sure that your presence observing isn't disruptive or, you know, kind of get in the way of people treating a patient or something like that. Okay. In terms of qualitative research on medical education, it really is not so different from qualitative research in any environment, but you might be, for example, using interviews with medical educators to learn how they think about and manage work-life issues or burnout or things along those lines. And you might conduct focus groups with participants in a training program to find out what they found valuable about it and what they found problematic about it and what they would like to see improved. You might observe attendee resident interactions during rounds to identify communication patterns as a way of trying to figure out kind of what new training might need to be introduced or, you know, sort of where things go off the rails. Oops, I see some things in the chat. Oh, thank you, Kanti. I appreciate that. Okay. I'm not sure if you guys do qualitative research with kids, because my sense is you're focused more on educational issues with adults. But just some really quick things, and I have not done research with kids, so this is just gleaned from reading, but you really want to be mindful of developmental stages. There's not much point in interviewing kids below, say, 7. They just aren't where they need to be in order to reflect on their experiences. You want to use interviews, not focus groups, because kids rile each other up and they're hard to manage. You want to keep the language super simple, be super flexible, kind of let the kid take the interview where they need to take the interview, and keep the number of questions super short. 3 is generally a good rule of thumb. And because there's a lot of social desirable, you know, kids want to say what you want to hear. They want to make you happy. Make it really clear that there are no right or wrong answers. All right, how are we doing for time? Data analysis. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. These are the stages in data analysis and coding, the sort of stage of coding, where first you transcribe or you hire someone to describe your interviews. So now it's in text, not audio form. Then you read through all those transcripts, just sort of let it wash over you. Kind of let them tell you what it is that they have to say. And then you begin open coding, which is nothing more or less than sort of just writing margin notes about what kinds of patterns you're beginning to see, and getting preliminary ideas for coding categories. And then you move on to code book development. And codes sound fancy and they sound really complicated, but all they are is a label that you attach to different chunks of qualitative data so that you can find it later and organize it. It's not the final stage in analysis. So, you know, whether you do it 100% perfectly is really not the point. It's a means to an end. It's a way of taking this chaotic, complicated, rich, thick data that is transcripts and putting it into some format where you can find what you're looking for later and organize it in order to find themes. So after you develop a code book, you code the data. You might do that yourself alone, or you might do it with another member of your research team, checking to see whether you agree, and where you don't agree, adjudicating the disagreement to sort of say, okay, I applied this code here, you didn't. What were you thinking? What was I thinking? And generally it's quite easy to find agreement. Like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. I hadn't thought about it that way. So that's what happens at the stage of codebook development. And then you analyze your data. And there are two sort of general ways or, approaches to analyzing data. One's a little bit simpler, one's a little bit more complex. Content analysis is really, Noelle, go ahead before I move on.
Yeah, I had a question about the last slide. So who in the coding, when you were saying there's two, is there a standard for how many people will code? And
it depends on the size of your data set. If it's a big national study or something, you might have, dozens of coders, but for a small kind of customary size study is usually 2. And it's just a way of cross-checking your interpretations. And really the point of having 2 people code data is the discussion around it as a way of really advancing your understanding of the data and what it's telling you. So 2 people coding, usually they co-code a subset of the data, 25% is pretty typical, and look at how they coded there and reconcile all the differences and then go off and code the remaining things individually. That's usually how it works.
okay, thank you.
Sure. So what you might produce in the results section of a paper is either a content analysis or a thematic analysis. Some people do not consider these all that meaningful distinctions. I do, but you'll see thematic analysis used frequently for what I would consider a content analysis, but hey. A content analysis is more kind of surface level and descriptive, just like what am I seeing in each of the sort of content buckets that I've identified in my data. So what are the benefits of this program? What are the problems with this program? Just kind of buckets. And then you describe what it is you see there. Whereas thematic analysis is more interpretive. It goes beyond those buckets and sort of looks for themes and issues that cut across coding categories and interview questions, and look for more nuance. It requires more from the researcher, right? More interpretation of the data. It's not just sort of saying, here's what I found, but it's like, here's the meaning of what I found. So content analysis deals more with surface structures, just kind of like, here it is. This is what I found. There you go. And thematic analysis looks more at deep structures. So kind of like you could do things like say, I sensed a lot of reluctance among these interviewees to talk about X, or they conveyed discomfort with Y. Maybe they didn't say that in so many words that you can point to, but it came across in the interviews and it's something you can say something about. This requires a little bit more explanation than we have time for, so I'm going to jump over it, but happy to have another conversation. Content analysis tends to report its categories in noun or verb phrases, benefits, drawbacks, suggestions for improvement, or growing confidence or networking opportunities, things that might come out of an analysis of a program. Thematic analysis tends to use sentences, so it gets you a little farther towards sort of what you're saying about the data. So, for example, participants in this program didn't view themselves as leaders. They were in a leadership program, but many of them did not really feel like leaders, or they had ambivalence about leadership, which they thought of as hierarchical and coercive. And that's where, frankly, I feel like you get into really good stuff, but, where you really look at those sorts of nuances. When you are writing up qualitative data, a really good rule of thumb, this is something that Megan Ham, my colleague, often mentions, is imagine that you're at a party, right? You've done your research, you've looked at all your data, you've done the coding, you're at this point sort of engaged in analysis, and you're at a party and somebody says, hey, about that qualitative study that you're working on, what are you finding? What would you say? And that gets you out of the weeds and takes you up to a level where you can kind of really see what matters in the data and what would interest other people. And so that's a really good sort of beginning point for identifying themes in your data. Also, a good set of themes, so again, this is your results section, is internally coherent, consistent, and distinct. Each theme occupies its own space and doesn't overlap with the others. That it interprets and makes sense of the data, it doesn't just describe it. So we're talking thematic analysis here. that it represents the data faithfully, and this is really important, is to keep going back to your data and to your quotes and saying, is this theme really what I'm seeing? Is this what the data says? Does this feel accurate? And make sure you have quotes that can support your analysis. It should tell a meaningful and well-organized story. You just recognize it in a paper when the themes have a kind of a logical narrative arc to them. And it addresses the research question. It doesn't go off onto into tangents that might be other papers. All right, we've got 10 minutes. Okay, that's pretty good. A quick note about evaluation criteria. So it is important to recognize that qualitative research has its own evaluative criteria, its own measures of rigor and quality, and that applying quantitative criteria to qualitative studies distorts things and creates problems. For that reason, qualitative researchers have developed their own set of words. So rather than using external validity, internal validity, generalizability, things like that, they use this overarching notion of trustworthiness. Is the study trustworthy? Is it credible? So that's broken down into, and if you need a citation for that, Guba and Lincoln came up with this a while back. So credibility has to do with the confidence that the results are true and accurate. I feel confident. This is really sort of a measure of confidence, right? I feel like I have done due diligence, talked to enough people, talked to the right people to say that the results are true, that I am representing it faithfully. Dependability has to do with your confidence that the results are repeatable. You know, that somebody else doing research would get something similar. They never get anything identical because every researcher is a different human being interacting with other human beings in particular scenarios. That it's confirmable that somebody else could corroborate the results, that you're not just going off inventing things out of whole cloth, but somebody else would see the same thing. And transferability, which is not generalizability, but it is the idea that this, I'm not just speaking about these 20 people, I'm describing a larger phenomenon. And it could be generalized to a larger group of nurses or patients or doctors. And then these things on the right are methods that qualitative researchers use to ensure rigor. So the investigator's skill and experience, maybe particularly with sensitive topics, is worth including in a paper because that speaks to, you know, their ability to really get at important things and ask, you know, conduct a deep interview. Whether the methods are appropriate for the research question. In terms of dependability, you describe your methods in as much detail as the word limits of a journal allow, and believe me, they don't allow because they're not designed for qualitative research, but you try to describe as much as possible what you did, why you did it. Measures of intercoder reliability, which really get at, you know, did you and I code this the same? Are we seeing this the same way? Is there enough kind of solidity to the codes that other people can kind of apply them in the same way? Triangulation, which could involve asking members of your study population, does this sound right to you? Did I represent this accurately? And comparing it to the literature on the topic to see whether you're really far afield, which might be because you've discovered something new, or it might be because you haven't done it well. And transferability can be ensured both through really smart sampling and reaching data saturation in the way we've discussed. So I know this is a kind of a very, very rapid tour through this, but for that reason, and because qualitative research is complicated and fascinating, you might need help if you're taking your first foray into this. So I wanted to describe sort of who's out there at Pitt who might help if you're looking for that. So first of all, and I don't think this is an exhaustive list, there are various qualitative service centers around. Qualis is the center run by Megan Ham, my colleague, and they offer a number of qualitative services. Peru in the School of Pharmacy and QDAP in the Center for Social and Urban Research provide various kinds of services of this sort. So they might help you with data collection or do it for you, right? You hire them, they do the interviews. You work with them to develop a good interview guide and you talk to them about your goals and you but they conduct the interviews, or they do the data transcription, or they do the codebook development, or they do the coding, or the analysis, or all of it. It's not cheap. So Megan estimates $1,000 per interview if they do everything. But you can hire them for certain parts, like transcription, which is a huge time sink that may not be worth it for you, or you could use a transcription software, which they're getting better and better. I see something in the chat. Oh, there we go. So the answer really depends on your budget, what you can afford to get one of these folks to do. Qualis is also on the expensive end compared to those others. But what you don't want to do is short data collection. Everything else relies on getting good data. So that's where you really want to make sure that you that you have good interviewers really probing and making sure they focus on the research question and exploring it in enough detail for you to get good data. My advice here, if you're new to this, is find a mentor who can guide you through this, and I'll give you a list of them in a second. To engage methodologists, your mentor or people from Qualis or whatever, early and often. You don't want to wait too long, or you'll make mistakes at different stages that then are very difficult to undo. Use a simple theoretical sort of orientation like qualitative description. You don't have to get fancy or say something's phenomenological when it really isn't, or grounded theory when it really isn't. Keep it simple. Don't do a lot of jargon bombing, even though it sounds cool. And keep your study design simple. It doesn't have to be something really elaborate. It can be interviewing 25 people, Don't cut corners on data collection. When you're doing coding, we use the terms lumping and splitting, that some people are lumpers. They sort of assign codes that are larger, encompass more, whereas splitters kind of, delineate finer categories. Personally, I'd say if you're new to this, kind of lean towards lumping. And then you pull up those codes using a qualitative coding software, and you see a lot of things of different sorts, and you can do more of your analysis at that stage. Content analysis is easier than thematic analysis, and it's perfectly respectable. And then the other thing, and this is advice we've gotten from a lot of our mentors, is you really need to learn to trust yourself in qualitative research. You are the instrument of data collection. It's your thinking and your insights and your intuitions that produce the best results. That's probably been trained out of you if you've come through quantitative channels, but you have to trust them, but then you check them against the data. Here are some mentors within the School of Medicine. All of these folks have been asked whether they're willing to be mentors to people who are doing qualitative research. In terms of training, we offer 2 one-credit courses at the Institute for Clinical Research Education, Qualitative Research Methods 1 and 2. The first one really focuses on the sort of the theory and the whys and the whats of qualitative research, and the second, the hows. And then I've been working on this self-paced online course called the Power of Qualitative Research that I'm really excited about. And if anybody wants to explore this more and would be willing to give me feedback, I would love to, kind of sign you in as pilot testers, and you can do as much or as little of it as you want. So I feel like I have been fire hosing you guys, hitting you with a lot of information and not much time to discuss it, but that's kind of where I am. Here are a couple very useful resources, and we have a few minutes for thoughts, questions.
That was great. Thank you. So informative. I mean, you make it all look so simple.
I kind of want to, it's time consuming, and there's a lot of art to it, but it's not complicated. It's, some of the things that seem intimidating about it, I think don't need to be. Whereas, people I think often overestimate how intimidating it's going to be and underestimate the amount of time it's going to require.
Right.
Marie, could you actually speak to, sorry, I will just take a minute here. Marie, it's wonderful to meet you, finally. It's been about 20 years in the making. I'm Pitt Anthro trained. also worked in Nepal just a few years after you. Rich
Double
Sky
woo-woo.
this for years, and we'll hold him to it at some point. But I'm a new faculty member in our complex care center. It's very much a desire and passion of mine to get back and integrate qualitative medical anthropology in my work. But I will admit it's not on my radar for this first or second year of that new position. And having some sense of how much time should one be thinking about as they, move into starting, qualitative research. I've certainly done it. I had the dissertation period and these things, but that was fully dedicated time. And I'm like, can I really accomplish something with, 1 day of research time per week when it's always, crowded by clinical responsibilities too?
So there's so many, it depends, like whether you have a budget to hire help, sort of how accessible your research participants are and how difficult it will be to do things like, schedule interviews. But I would say, I think I would say a year to give yourself time to do the interviews, code, and analyze for a small study, 20 to 30 in there. Some people are faster, some people are slower, but that seems to me reasonable. Again, sort of another dependency is how much protected time or time dedicated for research you've got. But I think you can get a good little qualitative study done in a year. Yeah. That probably wouldn't include writing a grant or, the things that precede it, but yeah.